I just came to check my account, sir.
A ragged boy walked into the most exclusive private club in London. "I just want to check my account," he whispered. The wealthy chairman burst into laughter, but when the screen lit up, his smile froze forever. The morning fog lifted slowly over Mayfair, revealing the gleaming white facades and wrought-iron balconies that had housed British aristocracy for 3 centuries. At 12 years old, Oliver Webb had learned that there were two types of people in this city: those who belonged in buildings like these, and those who scrubbed their floors after everyone else went home. Today, for the first time in his life, Oliver was about to cross that invisible line. His trainers, 2 sizes too large and held together with electrical tape, squeaked against the polished marble floor as he pushed through the heavy brass doors of Worthington and Sterling Private Members Club. The blast of warm air hit him like a wall, so different from the November drizzle outside where he'd spent the last 3 hours working up the courage to enter. The entrance hall was unlike anything Oliver had ever seen. Marble columns stretched 20 feet high, supporting a ceiling painted with scenes of hunting parties and country estates. Crystal chandeliers, each probably worth more than his entire tower block, cast a warm glow over burgundy leather furniture that seemed too perfect to actually sit on. Everything smelled expensive, a mixture of fresh flowers, polished oak, and something else he couldn't quite identify. Money, perhaps. Success, belonging, things he'd never known. Oliver clutched the worn envelope in his pocket, feeling the edge of the membership card inside. His fingers were dirty. There hadn't been hot water in his flat for 4 days, and he was acutely aware of the smudge of grime on his face that he'd tried and failed to wash off at a public toilet that morning. "May I help you?" The voice came from a man behind a sleek mahogany reception desk. He was looking at Oliver the way people in this part of the city always looked at him, like he was something unpleasant that had accidentally wandered in from the street. Oliver's voice came out as a whisper. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I need to check my account." The man's perfectly groomed eyebrows rose slightly. "I'm sorry, young man, but this is a private establishment. Perhaps you're looking for the Barclays down on—" "I have an account here," Oliver interrupted, immediately regretting how desperate he sounded. "I have a card." He pulled out the envelope with trembling hands, extracting the black card that had arrived in his letterbox 6 months ago. He'd been too afraid to use it until now, too afraid that it might be some kind of mistake that would get him in trouble. But yesterday, when Mr. Okonkwo from the corner shop had told him he couldn't give him any more food on credit, he'd realized he had no choice. The receptionist's expression shifted from disdain to confusion as he looked at the card. It was clearly from this club. The crest matched. But Oliver could see him struggling to understand how a child who looked like he'd been sleeping rough could have membership at one of the most exclusive establishments in London. "I see," the man said slowly, his tone suggesting he saw nothing at all. "Well, you'll need to speak with one of our account managers. If you'll just wait over there." He gestured to a seating area, but Oliver barely heard him. His attention had been captured by the man striding across the entrance hall as he owned it, which, according to the nameplate on the massive desk he was approaching, he basically did. Charles Worthington III. Even Oliver, who knew nothing about high society, had heard of Charles Worthington. His face was in the financial pages of every newspaper, always with that same confident smile that said he'd never known a moment of doubt or hardship in his entire life. At 47, he was considered one of the most successful private wealth managers in the country, handling estates for aristocrats, tech billionaires, and old money families who'd been rich since before the Industrial Revolution. He wore a suit that probably cost more than Oliver's mum used to make in a year. His shoes were so perfectly polished that Oliver could see the chandelier reflected in them. His silver-streaked hair was styled in a way that looked casual but clearly wasn't. And his watch— Oliver had seen enough luxury watches in shop windows to recognize a Patek Philippe— could have fed every family in his tower block for a month. Charles Worthington was everything Oliver wasn't. Powerful, respected, untouchable, and he was staring directly at Oliver with an expression of amused disgust. "Geoffrey," Charles called to the receptionist, his voice carrying across the hall with the easy authority of someone who'd never been ignored in his life. "Is there a reason we're allowing street urchins into the building? I thought we had security for this sort of thing." The words hit Oliver like a physical blow. Around the entrance hall, other members, all dressed in expensive suits and designer dresses, turned to stare. Oliver felt his face burning, a mixture of shame and anger that made his eyes sting. "Sir, the young man claims he has an account," Geoffrey began. "An account?" Charles's laugh was sharp and cruel. "Look at him, Geoffrey. He's got dirt on his face, and his clothes look like they came from a charity bin. The only account he's familiar with is probably the one his parents opened at the local betting shop." More laughter rippled through the hall. A woman in pearls covered her mouth with a manicured hand, her eyes sparkling with mean delight. A man in a pinstriped waistcoat shook his head, muttering something to his companion about standard slipping. Oliver wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, push back through those brass doors, and never come back. He'd been stupid to think he could belong here, even for 5 minutes. He'd been stupid to think a card in an envelope could change anything about who he was or where he came from. But then he thought about Mr. Okonkwo's apologetic face. He thought about the eviction notice on his door. He thought about his little sister, Lily, who'd asked him that morning if they'd have tea tonight, and the way his stomach had twisted when he'd had to tell her he didn't know. He thought about his mother. "I have a card," Oliver said again, louder this time. His voice shook, but he forced himself to step forward, to walk across that perfect marble floor toward Charles Worthington's desk. "I just want to check my account." Charles's expression shifted from amused to irritated. Clearly he'd expected Oliver to run away crying. The fact that this dirty child was actually approaching him seemed to offend him on a personal level. "Security," Charles called out, but held up a hand when 2 uniformed guards started moving toward them. A new expression crossed his face, one Oliver couldn't quite read. It looked almost like curiosity. No, not curiosity, something more predatory, like a cat that had found a mouse and decided to play with it before the kill. "Actually, wait," Charles said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "This could be entertaining." He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers in front of him. "Come here, boy. Let's see this account of yours." Oliver walked forward on legs that felt like they might give out at any moment. He could feel every eye in the hall watching him, judging him, finding him lacking. His 2 big trainers seemed impossibly loud against the marble. The envelope in his hand felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. When he reached Charles's desk, he had to look up to meet the man's eyes. Charles was still smiling, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who was about to enjoy themselves at someone else's expense. "Let me guess," Charles said, loudly enough for everyone in the hall to hear. "You found this card in the rubbish, or maybe you nicked it from someone's post. That's a criminal offense, you know. I could have you arrested right now." "I didn't steal it," Oliver said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It came to my flat. My name is on it." "Your name is on it," Charles repeated mockingly. "And what might that name be? Should I be expecting a trust fund baby hiding under all that grime?" "Oliver," he said. "Oliver Webb." Charles's fingers flew across his keyboard, his expression one of exaggerated patience, like a parent humoring a child's ridiculous story. "Oliver Webb," he repeated. "Well, let's see what we find, shall we? I'm sure this will be fascinating." The typing seemed to go on forever. Oliver could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Around the hall, people had stopped even pretending to mind their own business. They were all watching, waiting to see this poor child get exposed as a thief or a liar or whatever Charles Worthington decided he was. Oliver's hand went to his pocket, touching the only other thing he always carried, a small, worn photograph of his mother. She was smiling in the picture, back before she got sick. Back when she still believed that working 3 jobs might somehow be enough to build a better life for her children. She'd been wrong about that. But maybe, just maybe, she'd been right about something else. Charles's fingers stopped typing, his eyes locked onto his screen, and for just a fraction of a second, Oliver saw his confident expression flicker. And it was barely noticeable, just a slight widening of the eyes, a tiny tightening around the mouth. But it was there. Then the professional mask slammed back into place, and Charles's smile grew even wider. "Well, well," Charles said, his voice dripping with false sweetness. "It appears you do have an account, Oliver Webb. How about that?" He paused dramatically, milking the moment for all it was worth. Ladies and gentlemen, it seems we have a genuine member among us. The account shows a balance of... He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes returning to the screen. This time, the flicker of surprise lasted longer. His smile froze on his face, taking on a slightly strained quality. The balance shows... Charles tried again, but his voice had lost some of its mocking certainty. Oliver watched as the man's face went through a series of rapid changes: confusion, disbelief, shock, and something else. Something that looked almost like fear. "That's impossible," Charles whispered, so quietly that only Oliver could hear. "That's absolutely impossible." Charles Worthington had seen many things in his 25 years of private wealth management. He'd watched tech entrepreneurs become billionaires overnight. He'd seen old fortunes crumble and new ones rise. He'd witnessed the kind of wealth that most people couldn't even imagine. The kind that existed in a completely different reality from the world where normal people worried about rent and groceries. But he had never, not once in his entire career, seen anything like what was currently displayed on his screen. The number didn't make sense. It couldn't be real. It had to be a glitch in the system, some kind of error that would be corrected as soon as their IT department noticed it. Because there was absolutely no possible way that this dirty child standing in front of him, this boy who looked like he hadn't had a decent meal in weeks, could have that kind of money in an account. "There seems to be a technical issue," Charles said carefully, his professional mask firmly in place despite the chaos in his mind. "The system is showing, well, it's clearly displaying incorrect information." "What does it say?" Oliver asked, his voice small and uncertain. Charles looked at the boy, really looked at him for the first time. The dirt on his face wasn't just smudge marks from playing outside. It was the kind of dirt that accumulated when you didn't have reliable access to hot water. And his clothes weren't just old or unfashionable, they were literally falling apart, held together with visible repairs. The electrical tape on his trainers wasn't a fashion statement or even a temporary fix. It was a permanent solution to a problem that couldn't be solved any other way. This was a child living in real poverty, the kind of poverty that Charles had spent his entire life insulated from, the kind he'd maybe seen in documentaries but never had to personally confront. And according to the screen in front of him, this child had an account balance of £38 million. "Geoffrey," Charles called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "Can you come here for a moment, please?" The receptionist hurried over, his brogues clicking against the marble. "Yes, Mr. Worthington? I need you to verify something on your terminal. I'll look up the account for Oliver Webb." He spelled out the account number, watching Geoffrey's face carefully. Geoffrey's fingers moved across his keyboard with practiced efficiency. Charles saw the exact moment when he found the account. His eyes went wide and all the color drained from his face. "Sir," Geoffrey whispered, leaning close so only Charles could hear. "The balance shows—" "I know what it shows," Charles cut him off. "The question is whether you're seeing the same thing I'm seeing, or if this is isolated to my terminal." "It's the same," Geoffrey confirmed, his voice shaking slightly. £38.4 million. The last deposit was 6 months ago. No withdrawals, no activity of any kind since the account was opened. Charles's mind was racing. This had to be some kind of money laundering operation. Or maybe the account belonged to the boy's parents, and they were criminals who'd set up the account in their son's name to hide assets. That had to be it. There was no other logical explanation. "Oliver," Charles said, his tone shifting to something more serious, "I need you to be very honest with me. Where did you get this card?" "It came in the post," Oliver said, 6 months ago. There was a letter with it." "A letter from whom?" "From my mum." Oliver's voice cracked slightly on the last word. "Before she died." The hall, which had been buzzing with curious whispers, fell suddenly silent. Charles felt something uncomfortable twist in his chest. Something that might have been shame, though he quickly pushed it away. "I see," Charles said carefully. "And your mother was—" "A cleaner," Oliver said, lifting his chin slightly in defiance of the shame that Charles was clearly expecting him to feel. "She worked 3 jobs, sometimes 4. She cleaned offices at night, worked at a laundrette during the day, and did whatever else she could find." That made even less sense. A cleaning lady with £38 million. Unless, "Oliver, is it possible your mother was involved in something illegal?" Charles asked, trying to sound diplomatic rather than accusatory. Sometimes people in difficult financial situations make choices that— My mum wasn't a criminal, Oliver said sharply, with more force than he'd shown since entering the building. She was the best person I ever knew. She worked herself to death trying to give me and my sister a better life. Charles noticed the other members in the hall shifting uncomfortably. The woman with the pearls who'd been laughing earlier was now staring at her shoes. The man in the pinstriped waistcoat had turned away, suddenly very interested in his mobile. Of course, Charles said smoothly. I didn't mean to suggest. Look, why don't we move this conversation somewhere more private? Jeffrey, can you escort Mr. Webb to meeting room B? Actually, a new voice cut in, I'll take it from here. Charles looked up to see Edward Harris, one of the club's senior account managers, striding across the hall. Edward was 65, had been with the establishment for over 30 years, and had a reputation for being both extremely competent and completely unimpressed by Charles's usual theatrics. Edward, I'm handling this, Charles said, trying to inject authority into his voice. No, Charles. You're making a scene, Edward replied calmly. And you're about to make a very serious mistake. He turned to Oliver with an expression that was actually kind. The first kind expression the boy had seen since entering the building. Hello, Oliver. My name is Edward Harris. Would you mind coming with me? We can sort all of this out in a more comfortable setting. Oliver looked between the two men, clearly unsure who to trust. Finally, he nodded. As Edward led Oliver toward the lifts, Charles felt his control of the situation slipping away. He stood up quickly. Edward, I really think I should be present for— You've done enough, Edward said without looking back. Stay here and attend to your other members. I'll handle this. Charles watched helplessly as Edward and Oliver disappeared into the lift. Around him, the hall was still silent. Everyone had witnessed his humiliation of a 12-year-old boy, who apparently had more money than most of Charles's regular clients. He sat back down at his desk, trying to regain his composure, but he could feel the stares, could sense the judgment. For the first time in years, Charles Worthington felt something he thought he'd left behind in his childhood. Shame. Upstairs in a comfortable meeting room with soft lighting and furniture that actually looked inviting, Edward Harris was making Oliver feel something he hadn't felt since entering the club. Safe. First things first, Edward said, pouring Oliver a glass of water from a crystal decanter on the table. Are you hungry? I can have someone bring up some food. Oliver's stomach growled audibly, answering the question. He nodded, embarrassed. Edward picked up the telephone and ordered sandwiches, fruit and biscuits. Enough for 3 people, he specified, even though there were only 2 of them in the room. When he hung up, he settled into the chair across from Oliver with a gentle smile. Better? He asked. Why are you being nice to me? Oliver asked suspiciously. Everyone else here looks at me like I'm rubbish. Because, unlike Charles Worthington, I actually remember what it's like to have nothing, Edward said simply. I grew up in Bethnal Green in the 60s. My father was a dock worker. My mother cleaned offices. I was the first person in my family to go to university, and I only managed that because of scholarships and working 3 jobs. Oliver studied Edward's face, looking for signs of deception, but the older man's eyes were sincere. Now, Edward said, pulling out a tablet, let's talk about your account. I've pulled up the file, and I have to say it's quite remarkable. The account was opened 6 months ago by your mother, correct? I think so, Oliver said. She never told me about it. I just got the card and a letter in the post after she— He couldn't finish the sentence. May I see the letter? Edward asked gently. Oliver pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. It had been read and reread so many times that the creases were beginning to tear. He handed it to Edward with trembling fingers. Edward unfolded the letter carefully and began to read. As his eyes moved across the page, his expression shifted from professional curiosity to deep emotion. When he finished, he had to clear his throat before speaking. Oliver, he said softly. Your mother was an extraordinary woman. Can you tell me what the money is? Oliver asked. I don't understand where it came from. We never had money. We could barely pay rent. Mum worked all the time, but we were always skint. Edward looked at the account details on his tablet, then back at the letter, then at Oliver. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. 6 months ago, your mother came to this club. She didn't come to the main entrance. She used the service entrance because she was working here as part of a cleaning crew. But she managed to get an appointment with one of our newer account managers, someone who was willing to listen to her story. What story? Oliver leaned forward. Your mother had been saving money for years. Every single extra pound she made went into a biscuit tin under her bed. She told our account manager that she knew she was ill, that the doctors had told her she didn't have much time, and she wanted to make sure you and your sister would be taken care of. Oliver felt tears starting to form in his eyes. But we were so poor. How could she have saved that much? She didn't, Edward said gently. The money in your account isn't from savings, Oliver. It's from a life insurance policy. Life insurance? Oliver's voice was barely a whisper. Edward nodded. Your mother had been paying into a life insurance policy for over 10 years. Small payments, probably 15 or 20 pounds a month, that she somehow found the money for even when you didn't have enough for food. The policy had a value of £40 million. The number was so large that Oliver couldn't even process it. £40 million. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But there's more, Edward continued. Your mother was very specific about how she wanted the money managed. She set up a trust with very particular conditions. The money is yours, but it's protected. You can't access the full amount until you're 25 years old. Until then, you have access to a monthly allowance that's more than enough to cover all your expenses. Housing, food, education, everything you need. Oliver stared at Edward, unable to speak. His mother, who'd worked herself to death, who'd worn the same 3 outfits for 5 years, who'd sometimes gone without eating so he and Lily could have tea, had somehow managed to leave them millions of pounds. Why didn't she tell me? Oliver finally managed to ask. According to her letter, Edward said, touching the worn paper gently, she didn't want you to know she was dying. She didn't want your last memories of her to be filled with grief and fear. She wanted you to remember her as strong, as capable, as taking care of you, even after she was gone. A knock at the door interrupted them. A young woman entered with a tray of food, set it down on the table, gave Oliver a kind smile and left. Eat, Edward encouraged. We have more to discuss, but you need food first. Oliver grabbed a sandwich and ate like he hadn't seen food in days, which wasn't far from the truth. As he ate, Edward explained more about the account, about the trust, about how Oliver would need a legal guardian to help manage things until he was older. What about my sister? Oliver asked between bites. Lily, she's only 8. Can this help her too? The trust covers both of you, Edward assured him. Your mother made sure of that. Lily is included in all the provisions. Oliver finished 2 sandwiches and was starting on a third when Edward's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and frowned. It seems Charles has been making calls, Edward said. He's very concerned about the legitimacy of your account. He's suggesting we need to involve the authorities, claims this might be money laundering or fraud. Oliver felt panic rising in his chest. But it's not. My mum. I know, Edward said firmly, and I have all the documentation to prove it. The insurance company, the trust documents, everything is completely legitimate and legal. Charles is having a difficult time accepting that he was wrong. He hates me, Oliver said quietly. He doesn't hate you, Edward corrected. He hates being made to look foolish. There's a difference. Charles Worthington has built his entire career on being the smartest person in the room, on being able to read people and situations instantly. You challenged that. You walked into his club looking like someone he could dismiss, someone he could mock for the entertainment of his wealthy members, and you turned out to be one of the wealthiest clients in the building. I'm not rich, Oliver protested. I'm just me. You're a 12-year-old boy with a £38 million trust fund, Edward said with a gentle smile. That makes you very wealthy indeed, whether you feel like it or not. Oliver looked down at his dirty clothes, his taped-together trainers, his hands that were still grimy no matter how much he'd tried to clean them. I don't feel rich. Give it time, Edward said. Now let's talk about what happens next. Charles Worthington was not accustomed to being wrong. In his carefully constructed world, he was always 3 steps ahead, always in control, always the one who determined how situations would unfold. But as he sat at his desk in the entrance hall, watching curious members pretend they weren't staring at him, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: genuine uncertainty. His phone buzzed with a text from Edward. Meeting room B. Now and Charles. Check your ego at the door. Charles's jaw tightened. Edward Harris had always been a thorn in his side, a reminder that success in wealth management didn't require the ruthless edge that Charles had cultivated so carefully. Edward succeeded through kindness, through genuine relationships with clients, through actually caring about the people whose money he managed. It was an approach Charles had always considered weak, inefficient, and outdated. But Edward had also never made a mistake like the one Charles had just made. The lift ride to the 3rd floor felt longer than usual. Charles checked his reflection in the polished brass doors, straightening his tie, smoothing his hair, the armor of perfection that had always protected him. Except today, that armor had cracked, and he wasn't sure how to repair it. When he entered meeting room B, the scene that greeted him was so unexpected that he actually stopped in the doorway. Oliver was sitting at the table, eating a sandwich with the kind of desperate hunger that spoke of too many missed meals. His face was cleaner now, someone had given him wet wipes apparently, and in the better light of the meeting room, Charles could see details he'd missed before. The boy had his mother's eyes, clearly, large, dark, expressive eyes that held too much sadness for someone so young. His hands, though small, showed calluses that suggested he'd been working, taking on adult responsibilities far too early. Edward was sitting across from Oliver, and spread between them on the table were documents. Lots of documents. "Charles," Edward said, his tone neutral but firm. "Thank you for joining us. Please, sit down." Charles took a seat, a feeling oddly like he was the one being evaluated rather than the other way around. Oliver glanced at him, then quickly looked away, focusing intently on his sandwich. "I've reviewed all the documentation regarding Oliver's account," Edward began, sliding a folder across the table to Charles. "Everything is completely legitimate. The money comes from a life insurance policy that his mother, Margaret Webb, had been paying into for over 10 years. The policy paid out 6 months ago upon her death. All proper taxes have been paid. All legal requirements have been met. This is not fraud, money laundering, or any other illegal activity." Charles opened the folder and began reading. With each page, he felt his certainty crumbling further. This wasn't some criminal enterprise. This was a mother who'd loved her children so much that she'd sacrificed everything, literally everything, to ensure they'd be taken care of after she was gone. Margaret Webb worked as a cleaning woman for several buildings in central London, Edward continued, including this one, actually. She probably cleaned this very room dozens of times. Charles felt something cold settle in his stomach. He thought about all the nights he'd worked late, leaving messes for the cleaning crew to handle. Coffee cups left on desks, papers scattered carelessly. Had Oliver's mother been one of the invisible people who'd cleaned up after him? Had he ever even noticed her? She worked 60 to 70 hours a week across 3 jobs, Edward went on, sometimes more. Every spare pound went either to her children or to this insurance policy. According to the insurance company's records, she never missed a single payment, not once in 10 years. Even when, Edward paused, checking his notes, even when she was hospitalized for 4 days with pneumonia 3 years ago, she made her payment on time. Oliver had stopped eating, his hands were clenched in his lap, and Charles could see tears streaming silently down his face. The policy she chose was specifically designed to grow in value over time, Edward explained. It started small, but with compound interest, and her consistent payments, it grew substantially. She structured everything through a trust to protect the children. Oliver and his sister Lily can't access the full amount until Oliver turns 25, but they have access to a monthly allowance that will more than cover all their needs. Housing, food, education, medical care, everything. Charles looked at the numbers. The monthly allowance was £12,000, more than enough for 2 children to live comfortably, to go to good schools, to have opportunities, but not so much that it could be wasted or mismanaged quickly. She thought of everything, Edward said softly, down to the smallest detail. She even included provisions for Lily's education specifically. University tuition is prepaid through a separate fund, and there are annual increases built into the allowance to account for inflation and changing needs as the children grow older. How did she know how to set all this up? Charles heard himself ask. This is sophisticated estate planning. Most wealthy clients don't structure their trusts this well. She researched, Oliver said quietly. It was the first time he'd spoken since Charles entered the room. I remember her staying up late at the library. She said she was taking online courses to improve her computer skills, but his voice broke. She was planning this. She was planning how to take care of us when she wasn't here anymore. Charles looked at this child, this boy he'd mocked and humiliated in front of a hall full of people, and felt something he'd successfully avoided feeling for most of his adult life: genuine shame. The letter she left for Oliver explains everything, Edward said, picking up the worn piece of paper. Would you like me to read it, or? Oliver nodded, wiping his eyes. He should know. Everyone should know what kind of person my mum was. Edward cleared his throat and began to read. My dearest Oliver, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And I'm so sorry I couldn't stay longer. I'm sorry for every birthday I'll miss, every graduation I won't see, every moment of your life I won't get to share. But I need you to know something important. I'm not sorry for the life I lived. People will look at what I did, working multiple jobs, being tired all the time, not being able to afford nice things. And they'll think I failed. They'll think I should have done something different, been someone different. But Oliver, I was exactly who I needed to be. I was your mother and Lily's mother, and that was the most important job I ever had. This money isn't an apology for not being rich when I was alive. It's a promise that you and Lily will have chances I never had, that you'll be able to choose what you want to be, and instead of just taking whatever work you can find, that you'll be able to dream without worrying about how to pay rent. But Oliver, and this is the most important part, money doesn't make you better than anyone else. It doesn't make you smarter, or kinder, or more deserving of respect. The world will treat you differently now. And you need to remember that the people who treat you well because you're rich are the same people who would have treated you badly if you were poor. Be kind to people who work hard jobs. Remember that I was one of those people. Remember that every cleaner, every shopkeeper, every worker you meet is someone's mother or father or child. They all have dreams. They all have worth. Money is just money. It's what you do with it that matters. Take care of your sister, study hard, build a good life. And most important, be happy. That's all I ever wanted for you, to be happy. I love you more than all the stars in the sky, more than all the words in all the books ever written. Forever your mother, Margaret Webb. The silence that followed was profound. Edward carefully refolded the letter and handed it back to Oliver, who clutched it like it was the most precious thing in the world, which Charles realized it was. I'm sorry, Charles heard himself say. The words felt foreign in his mouth, unpracticed. Oliver, I'm genuinely sorry for how I treated you downstairs. Oliver looked at him with those two old eyes. Are you sorry because you were wrong about the money? Or are you sorry because you were cruel to a child who didn't deserve it? The question cut straight to the heart of the matter. Charles wanted to say he was sorry for the right reasons, but the honest answer was more complicated. He was sorry because he'd been exposed as wrong in front of his members. He was sorry because this would damage his reputation. He was sorry because it was uncomfortable to confront his own cruelty. But looking at Oliver now, really seeing him for the first time, Charles felt something else stirring. A small voice that remembered being young, remembered his own mother who'd worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table before his father's business finally took off. A voice he'd been ignoring for so long that he'd almost forgotten it existed. Both, Charles admitted. I'm sorry for both reasons, and I know that's not good enough, but it's the truth. Oliver studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. And it wasn't forgiveness. Charles didn't expect forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. So what happens now? Oliver asked, looking between the 2 men. Now, Edward said, we set you up properly. You'll need a legal guardian until you're 18. Do you have any family? Oliver shook his head. Just Lily. Our mum was an only child, and our dad, he trailed off. We don't have anyone. Then we'll work with social services to ensure you and Lily have proper care, Edward said. But the trust provides funding for guardian compensation, so we should be able to find someone good, someone your mother would have approved of. We'll also need to move you out of your current housing situation immediately. I can help with that, Charles found himself saying. Both Oliver and Edward looked at him in surprise. What? Charles shifted in his chair. The boy is one of our most valuable clients. We have a responsibility to ensure his well-being. It wasn't entirely altruistic. Charles was already thinking about how this story could be spun, how a redemption arc might actually benefit his reputation. But it wasn't entirely selfish either. For the first time in a very long time, Charles Worthington was considering someone else's needs before his own. There's a residential building in Kensington, Charles continued. Luxury flats, full security, excellent schools nearby. The club owns several units for visiting members. I can have one prepared for Oliver and his sister within 48 hours. That's actually very generous, Edward said, clearly suspicious of Charles's motives but unable to deny that it was a good solution. Oliver looked overwhelmed. I can't, that's too much. I just needed to check my balance so I could buy groceries. Oliver, Charles said, and for once his voice held no condescension, no mockery, just simple honesty. Your life just changed completely. The money your mother left you means you never have to worry about groceries again. You never have to worry about rent or bills or any of the things that kept you up at night. Your mother made sure of that. But I don't know how to be rich, Oliver whispered. I don't know how to live like that. Then you'll learn, Edward said gently, one day at a time. And we'll help you. The afternoon light was fading over East London when Oliver and Charles arrived at the tower block Oliver had called home for the past 4 years. Charles's Bentley looked absurdly out of place on this street, like a spaceship that had accidentally landed in the wrong dimension. Charles had insisted on accompanying Oliver to collect his sister and their belongings. Edward had suggested sending a professional removal service, but Charles had surprised both of them by volunteering to go personally. The boy shouldn't have to face this alone, he'd said, though he suspected his real motivation was more complicated than simple kindness. Now, sitting in his car and looking at the building, Charles felt his carefully constructed world-view continuing to crumble. The tower block was 18 stories of crumbling concrete and broken windows. Rusted balconies hung precariously from the facade, many cluttered with satellite dishes and drying laundry. Rubbish bags were piled near the entrance, some torn open by foxes or stray cats. Graffiti covered the ground floor walls, some of it artistic, most of it just angry scrawls marking territory. "This is where you live?" Charles asked, then immediately regretted the question. Of course, this was where Oliver lived. Where else would a child whose mother worked 3 jobs be able to afford? "9th floor," Oliver said quietly. "The lift hasn't worked in 3 months, so we have to take the stairs." They got out of the car, and Charles locked it 3 times, checking each door handle. A group of teenagers sitting on the wall outside watched them with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Charles felt acutely aware of his expensive suit, his Rolex, and the leather briefcase he was carrying. He might as well have painted a target on his back. But then Oliver nodded to the teenagers. "All right, Jamal, Dwayne." "Oliver." One of the boys jumped up, concern evident on his face. "Bruv, where you been? Lily's been crying all day. Mrs. Adeyemi's been watching her, but she keeps asking for you." "I'm sorry," Oliver said. "I had to take care of something important. I'm here now." The teenager's eyes shifted to Charles, taking in the expensive suit with obvious distrust. "Who's this?" "Someone who's helping me," Oliver said simply. "It's all right, Jamal, I promise." The interior of the building was worse than the exterior. The corridor was dark, half the light fixtures were broken, and smelled of mildew, cooking spices, and something else Charles couldn't identify, but that made his stomach turn. The walls were water-stained, the floor tiles cracked and missing in places. They climbed the stairs, passing other residents, an elderly woman carrying shopping bags, whom Oliver helped despite clearly being exhausted himself. A young mother with a baby on her hip and 2 toddlers clinging to her skirt, who smiled wearily at Oliver, a man in a security guard uniform heading out for the night shift. Each time, Oliver greeted them by name. Each time they asked about Lily, about how he was managing, and each time Charles felt smaller and smaller. These people had nothing. They lived in conditions that Charles wouldn't have tolerated for a storage unit. But they cared about each other in a way that Charles's wealthy clients never did. They were a community, looking out for one another because they understood that survival required solidarity. When they reached the 9th floor, Oliver stopped in front of a door with peeling paint. The number 94 hung crooked, held by a single nail. He pulled out a key, then paused. "It's not much," Oliver said, not looking at Charles. "I know what you're thinking, but it was home." "I'm not thinking anything," Charles lied. In truth, his mind was racing with thoughts, none of them flattering to himself. Oliver opened the door. The flat was tiny, maybe 35 square meters total. There was a main room that served as a living room, dining room, and kitchen all at once. 2 doors led off to what Charles assumed were bedrooms, though he suspected they were barely larger than cupboards. The furniture was old and worn, held together with determination and tape. But the flat was clean, meticulously clean, and decorated with obvious love. Children's drawings covered the walls. A small bookshelf held well-worn paperbacks arranged by color. A vase of plastic flowers sat on a table, positioned to catch the afternoon light from the single window. "Oliver!" A little girl burst out of one of the bedrooms and threw herself at Oliver. She was 8 years old, small for her age, with the same dark eyes as her brother. Her clothes were clean but patched, her hair pulled back into plaits that were starting to come loose. "Lily!" Oliver hugged her tight. "I'm sorry I was gone so long. I'm so sorry." "Mrs. Adeyemi said you went to take care of grown-up stuff," Lily said, her voice muffled against Oliver's shoulder. "I was scared you weren't coming back." "I'll always come back," Oliver promised. "Always. But Lily, I have something important to tell you. Something about Mum." An older woman emerged from the other bedroom, Mrs. Adeyemi, Charles assumed. She was in her 60s, with kind eyes and worn hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. "Oliver," she said with obvious relief. "Thank the Lord. Lily's been so worried." Her eyes moved to Charles, instantly suspicious. "Who's your friend?" "This is Mr. Worthington," Oliver said. "He's from the bank. Mum left us some money, Mrs. Adeyemi. A lot of money." Mrs. Adeyemi's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession: surprise, disbelief, hope, and then something that looked like grief. "Margaret," she whispered. "That woman, she was always planning, always thinking ahead." She wiped her eyes quickly. "How much money, child?" Oliver looked at Charles helplessly. Even after spending hours discussing it, he still couldn't quite wrap his mind around the number. "Enough that they'll never have to worry again," Charles said gently. "Enough for excellent schools, a safe home, everything they need." Mrs. Adeyemi pressed her hands to her mouth, tears flowing freely now. "Margaret, you beautiful mad woman, you actually did it." "Did what?" Lily asked, looking confused. Oliver knelt to his sister's level. "Lily, remember how Mum always said she was going to make sure we were all right? That we'd always have what we needed?" Lily nodded solemnly. "She did it," Oliver said, his own tears starting. "She left us enough money that we can have a nice flat. And you can go to a good school. And we can have food whenever we're hungry, and—" His voice broke. "She took care of us, Lily. Even after she was gone. And she's still taking care of us." Lily was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then she asked the question that broke Charles's heart. "Does this mean we don't have to be hungry anymore?" Charles turned away, unable to watch, unable to bear the weight of that simple question. These children, these babies, had been living with hunger as a constant companion. While he'd been spending hundreds of pounds on business lunches he barely touched, these children had been wondering if they'd have tea. "No, sweetheart," Oliver said, pulling Lily close again. "We never have to be hungry again." Mrs. Adeyemi was openly sobbing now. "Your mother. She used to come home at 3 in the morning, and she'd still find energy to plait Lily's hair for school. She'd work doubles at the hospital at weekends and never complained, not once. We all knew she was poorly, but she kept working, kept smiling, kept telling us she was fine." "She wasn't fine," Oliver said quietly. "She was dying, and she knew it. But she didn't want us to know, because she didn't want us to be scared." Charles finally turned back to face the room. "She was protecting you," he said, "right to the very end. She was protecting you. Lily looked up at Charles for the first time, studying him with the directness that only children possess. Are you going to help my brother? Yes, Charles said, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in a long time. I'm going to help both of you. All right, Lily said simply, with the easy trust of a child who'd been taught that most adults were good people trying their best. Can we bring Rabbit? She held up a stuffed rabbit that had clearly seen better days. One ear was hanging by a thread. The fur was matted and thin. Charles suspected it had been repaired dozens of times. We can bring everything you want, Oliver assured her. They spent the next hour packing. There wasn't much to pack. A few changes of clothes each, some books, Lily's stuffed animals, Oliver's school papers, and photographs of their mother. Everything they owned fit into 4 bin bags and 1 small suitcase. Charles watched as Oliver carefully took down the drawings from the walls, and Lily collected her crayons and the notebook where she practiced writing her name. He watched as they said goodbye to Mrs. Adeyemi, who made them promise to ring her, to visit, to never forget where they came from. You're good children, Mrs. Adeyemi told them, hugging them both fiercely. Your mama raised you right. Don't let money change that. We won't, Oliver promised. As they carried the bags down the stairs, Charles insisted on taking the heaviest ones, despite Oliver's protests. Other residents came out to say goodbye, word having spread quickly about the children's good fortune. There was no jealousy in their faces, only genuine happiness. These people understood what it meant to struggle, and they were celebrating this rare victory. Jamal and his friends helped carry bags to the car. An elderly man gave Oliver a £20 note for emergencies, refusing to take it back even when Oliver tried to explain that he didn't need it anymore. A young woman gave Lily a chocolate bar for the journey. This, Charles realized, was what community looked like. What caring for your neighbors actually meant. Not charity galas where wealthy people wrote checks to feel better about themselves, but a real human connection. People were taking care of each other because it was the right thing to do. When they were finally in the car, bags loaded, Charles started the engine but didn't immediately drive away. He looked at Oliver and Lily in the rearview mirror, these 2 children who'd lost everything but still had their dignity, their kindness, their fundamental decency. Thank you, Oliver said quietly, for coming with me, for not making me do this alone. Charles gripped the steering wheel tightly. Oliver, I need to say something, and I need you to really hear it. Both children looked at him attentively. Oh, what I did to you this morning at the club, humiliating you, mocking you, treating you like you were nothing, was unforgivable. I've spent my entire career judging people based on their clothes, their addresses, and their bank accounts. I've convinced myself that money equals worth, that success equals superiority. He turned to look at them directly. But your mother, who cleaned toilets for a living, who worked herself to death, who never had expensive clothes or fancy cars, she was worth more than 1,000 men like me. She understood something I'd forgotten, that the measure of a person isn't what they have, it's what they give. Mum always said that being kind doesn't cost anything, Lily offered shyly. Your mother was a wise woman, Charles said, and I'm going to really try to be better. To be the kind of person who would have seen your mother's worth, who would have seen your worth regardless of the numbers in your bank account. Oliver nodded slowly. That's all she would have wanted, for people to try to be better. Charles put the car in gear and pulled away from the curb. In the rear-view mirror, he could see the residents of the tower block waving goodbye, see Mrs. Adeyemi wiping her eyes on her apron. As they drove toward Kensington, toward the luxury flat that would be Oliver and Lily's new home, Charles made himself a promise. He would help these children. Yes, but more than that, he would let them help him remember what really mattered. Help him become the kind of person who sees value in everyone, not just those who can afford his services. It was, he realized, the most important education he'd ever received, and his teachers were 12 and 8 years old. 3 months had passed since that Friday morning when Oliver Webb had walked into Worthington and Sterling Private Members Club with dirt on his face and fear in his heart. 3 months since Charles Worthington's carefully constructed world had been shattered by a 12-year-old boy and a letter from a mother who'd loved her children more than life itself. The luxury flat in Kensington had been transformed into something that actually felt like home. Lily's drawings now covered one entire wall. Charles had insisted on having them professionally framed, though Oliver had argued they were just crayon sketches. The furniture was still expensive, but Oliver had chosen pieces that were comfortable rather than impressive. Stuffed animals shared space with new books. The kitchen, which had seemed impossibly large at first, was now regularly filled with the smell of Lily learning to bake scones with their new guardian, Mrs. Oyalaran. Mrs. Oyalaran was a retired headmistress in her late 50s who'd lost her own son to leukemia 8 years earlier. When the social worker had introduced her to Oliver and Lily, she'd looked at them with the same fierce protectiveness that Margaret Webb had once shown. Within a week, she'd moved into the flat's guest room and had seamlessly become the steady, loving presence the children desperately needed. But the most dramatic transformation hadn't happened in the flat. It had happened in Charles Worthington. The morning after taking Oliver and Lily to their new home, Charles arrived at the club at 5 o'clock. 2 hours earlier than usual, he'd walked through every floor of the building, really looking at it for the first time in years. He'd noticed the cleaning crew working silently, emptying bins and hoovering carpets while the rest of the world slept. He'd watched them move through the rooms like ghosts, invisible and unacknowledged. At 6 o'clock, he'd done something he'd never done before. He'd introduced himself to the cleaning crew supervisor. "Good morning," he'd said to a startled woman named Blessing. "I'm Charles Worthington. I run this establishment, and I'd like to know your name and the names of everyone on your team." Blessing had stared at him like he was speaking a foreign language. In 22 years of cleaning this building, and no executive had ever spoken to her directly. Certainly not the chairman. But Charles had been patient. He'd learned every name, asked about their families, their lives, their challenges. And when Blessing had finally opened up, telling him about the impossible expectations, the poverty wages, the lack of benefits or respect, Charles had listened with the kind of attention he usually reserved for billionaire clients. By Monday morning, he'd called an emergency board meeting. "Gentlemen," he'd said to the assembled board members, "I'm proposing some changes to how we operate this institution." What followed was the most contentious board meeting in the club's 150-year history. Charles proposed tripling the wages of the cleaning and maintenance staff. He proposed providing health insurance, paid holiday, and pension contributions. He proposed creating a bursary fund for the children of service workers who wanted to pursue higher education. "Have you lost your mind?" one board member had shouted. "These costs will significantly impact our profit margins." "Good," Charles had replied calmly. "Our profit margins are obscene. We can afford to treat the people who make this building function like human beings rather than disposable resources." The vote had been close, but Charles had won. Barely. 2 board members had resigned in protest. Charles had thanked them for their service and hadn't bothered to hide his relief at their departure. Then he'd started making changes to how the club treated all its employees, not just the service workers. Exit interviews revealed a pattern of discrimination, favoritism, and fear-based management. Charles had sacked 3 senior managers who'd been creating toxic environments. He'd implemented transparent promotion criteria. He'd started actually listening to employees rather than just issuing orders. The financial press had been brutal. "Worthington goes soft," one headline read. "Banking executives' strange transformation worries investors," said another. Charles's peers at other institutions rang him privately, asking if he was having some kind of breakdown. He told them all the same thing. "I met someone who taught me what real wealth looks like, and it wasn't in a bank account." Now, sitting in his office on a crisp February afternoon, Charles was reviewing the quarterly reports when his assistant buzzed him. "Mr. Worthington, and Oliver and Lily Webb are here to see you." Charles smiled, something he found himself doing much more frequently these days. "Send them in." Oliver and Lily entered, and Charles still marveled at the transformation. Oliver wore clothes that actually fit. His face was clean and healthy-looking, and most importantly, the constant fear in his eyes had been replaced by something else. Not happiness exactly, the grief of losing his mother was still too fresh for that. But peace. Security. Hope. Lily was thriving. She'd started at a new school where she was getting top marks in every subject. She'd made friends. She'd gained weight. healthy weight that came from regular meals and not wondering where the next one would come from. She was 8 years old and finally getting to actually be 8 years old. Mr. Worthington, Lily said, running to hug him. She'd lost her initial shyness around him within the first week. I got full marks on my maths test. That's wonderful, Lily, Charles said, genuinely delighted. Did you bring it to show me? She pulled a paper from her rucksack, beaming with pride. Charles made a show of examining it carefully, then reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a gold star sticker, something he'd started keeping specifically for Lily's visits. This goes in your achievement book, he said solemnly, handing it to her. Lily carefully placed the sticker on her test, then sat down in one of the leather chairs, pulling out a book to read while the adults talked. Oliver took the other chair, his expression more serious. I wanted to talk to you about something. Of course. What's on your mind? I've been thinking a lot about what my mum wanted. Not just for Lily and me, but bigger than that. She wrote in her letter that money is just money. It's what you do with it that matters. Charles nodded, waiting. I want to start a foundation, Oliver said, for children like Lily and me. Children whose parents are working themselves to death but still can't make ends meet. I want to help them. Charles felt his throat tighten. That's a beautiful idea, Oliver. What kind of help are you thinking about? Everything, Oliver said, his voice gaining strength as he talked. School supplies, tutoring, food assistance, helping parents get better jobs. But also, and this is the important part, I want to help people see those children. Really see them. The way you didn't see me at first. The words stung. But Charles didn't flinch from them. You're absolutely right. What did you have in mind? Oliver pulled out a notebook. He'd clearly been planning this carefully. I've been researching other foundations, talking to Mrs. O'Yelleran about it. I want to call it the Margaret Webb Foundation for Working Families, and I want to donate £10 million from my trust to start it. Charles blinked. Oliver, that's a substantial amount of money. I know, Oliver said, but it's what Mum would have wanted. She didn't save all that money just so I could buy expensive things. She saved it so I could make a difference. You understand this is a long-term commitment? Charles asked carefully. Running a foundation is serious work. It requires oversight, administration, and careful planning. I know, Oliver said. Or that's why I was hoping you would help. Not just with the money part, but with making sure it actually helps people. You understand how to make things work in the business world. Charles was quiet for a long moment. 3 months ago, he would have dismissed this as a child's naive fantasy. But he'd learned enough since then to recognize that Oliver understood something profound, something Charles was still learning. I would be honored to help, Charles said, on one condition. Oliver looked wary. What condition? That you let me donate £10 million of my own money to match yours. Oliver's eyes widened. You'd do that. Oliver, 3 months ago, I was a man who measured success by the size of my bank account and the fear in my employees' eyes. I was miserable, even though I couldn't admit it to myself. Your mother's letter, the way she loved you and Lily, the way she sacrificed everything for you, it showed me what I'd been missing. Charles stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city. I've spent the last 3 months trying to be better, treating people with dignity, actually caring about the employees who work for me. And you know what I've discovered? What? I'm happier than I've been in 20 years, Charles said simply. I sleep better. I actually enjoy coming to work. I've reconnected with my daughter. Did I tell you I have a daughter? She's 27. For years she wouldn't speak to me because I'd been such a terrible father. But she rang me last week. She said she'd heard about the changes I was making and she wanted to meet for coffee. Oliver smiled. Oh, did you go? We had coffee for 3 hours, Charles said, his voice thick with emotion. 3 hours of actually talking, actually listening to each other. I told her about you and Lily, about your mother. I told her I was trying to learn how to be a better person. What did she say? She said it was about time. Charles laughed. But she also said she was proud of me. Do you know how long it's been since anyone said they were proud of me? Not impressed by my money or my success, but actually proud of me as a person. Lily looked up from her book. I'm proud of you, Mr. Worthington. The simple statement, delivered with such sincere conviction, nearly undid Charles completely. He had to clear his throat several times before he could respond. "Thank you, Lily. That means more than you know." Edward Harris appeared in the doorway, knocking gently. "Sorry to interrupt, but Charles, the BBC crew, is here for the interview." "Interview?" Oliver asked. Charles had been planning to tell Oliver about this, but the boys' foundation proposal had derailed his plans. "I've been asked to do an interview about the changes we've made at the club. I was going to ask if you'd be willing to participate, but you're under no obligation." "What kind of interview?" Oliver asked cautiously. "They want to talk about how meeting you changed my perspective on leadership and human dignity," Charles explained. "But I won't do it without your permission. Your story is your own." Oliver thought for a moment. "Will it help other people, other children who are struggling?" "I believe it could," Charles said honestly. "It might inspire other business leaders to examine how they treat their employees. It might help people understand that everyone deserves dignity and respect, regardless of their job or income." "Then I'll do it," Oliver decided. "But I want to talk about my mum, about who she really was." The interview took place in the club's meeting room. The reporter, a woman named Priya Sharma, was professional but warm. She'd done her research and approached the story with genuine interest rather than looking for scandal. "Mr. Worthington," Priya began, "3 months ago, you were known as one of the most ruthless executives in private wealth management. Your management style was described as cutthroat and intimidating. What changed?" Charles looked at Oliver, who nodded encouragingly. "I met a 12-year-old boy who showed me that I'd been measuring success with the wrong metrics," Charles said. "Oliver walked into my club looking for help, and I humiliated him in front of a room full of people because he didn't look wealthy. I judged him based on his appearance, his circumstances, his poverty. And then," Priya prompted, "and then I discovered he was one of the wealthiest clients in the building," Charles said. "But more importantly, I learned about his mother. Margaret Webb worked 3 jobs, cleaning hospitals and offices, working at a laundrette, and doing whatever she could find. She wore the same few outfits for years. She sometimes went without eating so her children could have tea. And while she was doing all of that, she was building a future for her children that was more impressive than anything I'd ever accomplished." Oliver took over the story, talking about his mother with a mixture of pride and grief that was heartbreaking to witness. He talked about her sacrifices, her love, her final gift to her children. Lily chimed in occasionally with memories of their mother plaiting her hair before school, of tucking them in at night, no matter how exhausted she was. "The money is wonderful," Oliver said. "It means Lily and I don't have to worry about food or housing or education. But the real gift my mum gave us was showing us how to be good people, how to work hard, how to care about others, how to never treat anyone as less than human." Priya turned to Charles. "And that lesson inspired you to make significant changes to how you operate your business." "It inspired me to become the kind of person I should have been all along," Charles corrected. "We've tripled wages for service workers, implemented comprehensive benefits packages, created bursary programs, and fundamentally changed our corporate culture from one based on fear to one based on respect." "Your critics say you've gone soft," Priya noted, "that you're sacrificing profitability for political correctness." Charles smiled. "Our profitability has actually increased. It turns out, when you treat employees well, they work harder, stay longer, and care more about the company's success." "Who knew?" The sarcasm in his voice made Priya laugh. "But more than that," Charles continued, becoming serious again, "I don't care what my critics say. I spent 47 years caring desperately about what other wealthy men thought of me, and it made me miserable. Now I care about whether I can look at myself in the mirror and feel proud of who I am. And for the first time in decades, I can." The interview went on for another hour, covering the details of the foundation Oliver wanted to start, the specific changes Charles had implemented, and the broader implications for corporate leadership. When it was finally over and the BBC crew had packed up their equipment, Oliver and Lily prepared to leave. "Thank you for doing that," Oliver said to Charles, "for being willing to talk about what happened." "Thank you for giving me the chance to be better," Charles replied. "You and Lily and your mother, you saved my life. I know that sounds dramatic. Oh, but it's true. I was living a life without meaning, without purpose, without a real human connection. You gave all of that back to me. Lily hugged him again. You're a good person, Mr. Worthington. I'm trying to be, Charles said. Every single day I'm trying. After they left, Charles sat alone in his office as the winter sun set over London. He thought about Margaret Webb, a woman he'd never met, but who'd changed his life completely. He thought about how many other Margaret Webbs were out there, working invisible jobs, sacrificing everything for their children, never getting recognition or respect. He picked up his phone and rang Edward Harris. Edward, I want to expand our employee support programs. I want to create a childcare centre in the building. I want to offer educational assistance, not just to employees, but to their children. I want— Charles, Edward interrupted gently, slow down. We can do all of those things, but we need to plan carefully. I know, Charles said, but I also know that every day we wait is another day that someone like Margaret Webb is working themselves to exhaustion without support. I don't want to wait anymore. Then we won't, Edward said simply. We'll start planning tomorrow. Charles hung up and turned to his computer. He had emails to write. To his daughter, suggesting they have dinner this weekend. To his ex-wife, apologizing for decades of emotional absence. To the employees he'd mistreated over the years, offering genuine apologies and, where possible, restitution. He had a lot of work to do, a lot of years to make up for, a lot of damage to repair. But for the first time in his life, Charles Worthington was doing work that actually mattered, and it had all started with a ragged boy asking to check his account, and a wealthy man who'd learned that true wealth wasn't measured in pounds, but in the lives you touched, the kindness you showed, and the dignity you extended to every human being. The screen had shown a number, £38 million, that had frozen Charles's smile. But it was what happened after, the lesson he learned from a boy and his sister and their mother's love, that had thawed his heart, and that transformation was worth more than any amount of money could ever be.